Hello, welcome back. It's me. Um, Today we're going to be looking at a review of concepts. Now, we've finished with the midterm and our 2 quizzes, so we're just, last evaluation is the final term paper. And hopefully you've had a look at the topics. Please do contact me if you need some help, some direction, if you just want to discuss some of the some of the material and the content, or look in more detail at some of the expectations other than what I've posted, I'd be happy to talk about it. Students actually, if I can say this with some modesty, appreciate and find it quite helpful when I try to assist them with getting going, or at least some of the basics of essay writing. Because after you've done it for a while, it's fairly straightforward. I don't know if I want to say formulaic, but there is a certain pattern to writing a good essay, and I think I could help you out with that if you send me an email, or if you want to call, of course. Either way, I'd be happy to look into the matters with you and give you a little coaching. So I thought for the presentation here, since we're not going to go into details, all of you at least, into details on the material left on the syllabus and in the textbook, some of you will look at that in some detail, I think, if you're looking at end-of-life issues, which is what the last few chapters cover. But I thought for the most part we would take a look at the important concepts that we've covered that I think for most all the subject topics that I have suggested for essays you will be using, or at least some of these some of these concepts. So we'll look at the concepts and discuss in brief some of the material in the last few chapters concerning death. Oh boy, okay, all right, let's have some fun. So first, I've been asked a couple times about the slippery slope argument that's been mentioned by our author there, Vincent Berry, in the textbook. The slippery slope argument is a specter that needs to be dealt with in ethics, and it's particularly relevant in bioethics. Now, the slippery slope argument is commonly a fallacy, which is to say it is the conclusion is wrong, basically, that's put forward in the argument, although it seems like it could be right. We're emotionally drawn to factors within the argument that make us think that the argument would be right. Usually it's wrong. However, sometimes it can be right. Sometimes it's not a fallacy, and sometimes it's a genuinely good, sound argument. So let's just look at it quickly here, what the slippery slope argument is, because it's been used in relationship to things like abortion, the exaggerated use of stem cell technology. For example, that stem cells could, the use of stem cells could, in the future, sort of pave the way for the degradation of human life in general, given that some people do view stem cells as human life, that if let's say we went down this path, destroying the early stage of what some people think is of human life, but what certainly is a life, undoubtedly of some sort, if that is destroyed in the early stage, that this would sort of open the door or be a first step towards the devaluing of life in general. And we've seen the same issue with abortion, and we see it at end-of-life issues as well. If we let euthanasia be used more liberally, specifically active euthanasia and physician-assisted death, what could that imply? Well, it might mean that, sooner or later, and it could be 50 years, it could be 500 years, that we might begin to devalue life in older age, life that is expensive to maintain, life that doesn't seem to have the value, let's say for enjoyment at least, that a life does when it's younger. That we could just simply put people to death if it would be more convenient socially. So that's certainly a big step from saying we could allow physician-assisted death in some cases. So it's a slippery slope argument. Is it right or is it wrong? Let me give you two examples of the slippery slope. First one is let's see, I'll give you the first one is the fallacy of the slippery slope. If you look historically, 20th century, it was the age politically, geopolitically, of the Cold Wars. So you had principally the United States opposing the Soviet Union, and then you had often these proxy wars in different parts of the world, in Central America, in what they used to call Indochina, but now called Southeast Asia. And this was where there was this possibility of expansion of communist sort of regimes moving into or taking over, basically, democratic countries, or countries at least that were more friendly to the capitalist economies. So the idea was, well, maybe this is like a domino effect. I mean, that's what they talked about. I remember this from the 70s and 80s, for example, when there were socialist revolutions in Central America and Nicaragua. And what it turned out that the US government in particular was they were afraid this was a slippery slope. Sort of one country becomes established as the sort of center of communism or socialism, and then other countries begin to fall. So first it's Nicaragua, then it's Guatemala, then it's Honduras, then it's Mexico, and then pretty soon they're knocking on the door of Texas, and the United States is threatened with socialist revolution. It's this, the idea is it's this first step that leads to disaster, that leads to a consequence that most people don't want. So, we had these wars, we had the United States and Vietnam and in Korea, and, trying to stop this, what they thought was sort of a progression of communist ideology. Well, it seems that this was a fallacy because, yes, for example, in Central America, Nicaragua did have an established socialist government, but that didn't trigger the whole domino effect of socialism and communism in Central America. And likewise, similar things happened in Africa. Not all of Africa went socialist when Angola did, for example. Not all of what they used to call Indochina or Southeast Asia went communist when Vietnam finally, from the American perspective, fell to communism. It seems like it was a false argument here. The slippery slope is visually, it's well titled. The idea is let's say you're walking across mountain climbing, across a slippery precipice on the edge of a cliff. And it's one wrong step, and you literally descend to disaster. You go tumbling down the mountain, breaking legs and bones, ending up in a frozen river, only to be taken away, finally to your death over a chilly waterfall at the end. One step can lead to catastrophe, ultimate chaos and disaster. Sometimes sometimes it's valid. You can imagine there are hiking trails in the world, the Himalayas, wherever, where such a thing is really so precarious and possible that one wrong step could lead to disaster. Usually, it doesn't happen. Marijuana was thought to be this gateway drug. One step of illegal drugs would lead you to, a heroin addict in the gutter, a few months later. It's improbable. I suppose it can happen sometimes given the, personality profile of the person, but usually not. And it didn't happen with the, U.S.-Soviet confrontation. It never did lead to sort of, when these communist governments were established, it never did lead to a kind of domino effect where the end was an extreme, let's say, entire continent of communism. That didn't happen. An example of the slippery slope where it was a valid argument, if we look back in history, and we'll just wrap this up with this final example. It was, the idea was in the 30s, Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Great Britain, said, well, the Nazis and Hitler, well, they've been talking about, expanding, reclaiming German lands. And indeed, that's what the rhetoric out of Germany was in the 30s. So Germany took back what they called the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia, part of the Czech Republic, I guess. They had an agreement, this Anschluss, it was called, with Austria. And the British were saying, well, let's just let the Germans have this. It's not going to lead to catastrophe. It's not going to lead to global or at least continental conflict. But it did, of course. We know that it didn't seem to stop. The Germans, went into Poland and then obviously, eventually into France and Denmark and, and so on. So that was a slippery slope, of course, with the Nazis. It did lead to disaster, that first step of annexing the old German lands in the Czech Republic, what today is the Czech Republic. So all to say that's a slippery slope. And that's why it's a tricky and appealing argument in some ways, because it's effective. Sometimes it's valid, sometimes it's not. And the devaluation of human life, this would be clearly a threat to, well, at least in bioethics, it would be a threat to our traditional understanding and relationship to humanity and what we think of as decent human rights. And that's why when the specter of devaluing human life is raised, when we look at something as relatively innocuous as destroying a few human cells, we're talking about at the embryonic stage, or, putting someone out of their misery who is, barely conscious, irredeemably ill, let's say brain damaged or something. Often it's not that these particular extreme cases are so divisive, although some people do oppose this just in principle, but it's what the liberalizing of this attitude could imply. It could imply simply that an eventual devaluation and degradation of respect for human life. And, who knows, again, what could happen in the long term. In the short term, probably not a lot's going to happen. But, human history is a long, isn't finished. There's much more to be written. Hundreds of years, who knows what could happen. Okay, so there are a couple other theories that I thought we'd just review quickly because it would be important if you're going to use them in your essays to have a good, and I think most of you probably should add some theoretical background or ethical theory background into your essays. One thing this will help is it'll give you some direction, I think. It provides a kind of basis. So here's some support. So if you begin talking immediately about utilitarianism, virtue theory, or deontology, it's not clear, and this is sort of a survey class, I mean, I think as you've seen, so it's fairly introductory. So it's not clear that you have, sort of demonstrated that you know the basics of what you're talking about. And so this shouldn't be too difficult. We've looked at it for a while. You can use up plenty of text and space describing what these theories are. So let's take a look here. One thing is called a famous essay in the 70s by Garrett Hardin, a utilitarian, was written called Lifeboat Ethics. And this highlights simply, I think, and clearly what the issues are at stake, morally speaking, when we talk about utilitarianism and deontology. So here's this is actually a famous painting called The Raft of the Medusa. And boy, are these people in trouble if you can see and look at the slide. The waters are treacherous. It looks like there's few rations on board, a lot of people sick. Garrett Hardin came up with an analogy for using basically his utilitarianism, and it's this. So imagine people are actually on a lifeboat, or let's say they're in a raft or something on the ocean, and it's unlikely that the amount of people that are on the raft are going to make it to shore because there's not enough rations, there's not enough water to go around. So what's to be done, morally speaking? Well, Garrett Hardin says, as the utilitarian, and remember what utilitarianism means. It means maximizing the greatest happiness for the greatest number. It means taking utility, which is to say units of pleasure or happiness, and using that as a guide for decision making. How can we maximize utility, pleasure, or happiness? Well, as it seems, if we keep everybody on the raft or everybody on the lifeboat, there's not going to be enough water, there's not going to be enough food and shelter from the sun or whatever. No one is going to make it back to shore. Everyone is going to die. There's no utility in that, Garrett Hardin says. So Hardin says, here's what we have to do. It's not pretty, but as a utilitarian, we only really have one choice. We have to take the people who are sick, those who clearly are, disabled in some way, who will not be able to make it to shore. We have to kick them off the lifeboat. We have to not allow them on, we have to get rid of them for the sake of the rest of those who are on the lifeboat surviving. Well, that's pretty brutal and pretty unfair. I mean, basically, it's just sort of random. I mean, it's kind of luck. Maybe you ended up with, a broken arm when the main ship went down and there was chaos on board. And now, because of this broken arm, you have this disability and you're less likely to be able to swim and to make it to shore when things get difficult. So you're kicked off the lifeboat. Or maybe you're older, or maybe you're a baby, maybe you're really young. But whatever it is, you're a handicap to those on board. Hardin says, and of course it's a difficult pill to swallow, Hardin admits, but it's better to have some make it to shore than to have none make it to shore. And if you turn this around, you say, well, what would the deontologist say? The Kantian. The Kantian, of course, says, we respect everyone universally. We always respect everyone's dignity. We respect the human rights. Each person is a placeholder of basically invaluable dignity and respect. We can never use anybody, in this way, we can never use anybody as a means to an end. That's what Kant says in his second categorical imperative. It is forbidden to use someone as a means to an end. So with that in mind, you can't sacrifice. There is no sacrifice for Kant. So what happens on the lifeboat? Well, everybody stays on the lifeboat because you can't, it's forbidden to sacrifice, to use anyone, to kick someone off the lifeboat. You would be using that person as a means for other people's ends, for other people's survival. Kicking someone off the lifeboat, it can't be done. So what happens? Well, it's beautifully fair in that way. I mean, the principle of justice is maintained. Everyone is treated equally, and no one survives. And so that's, I mean, Hardin points out, this is just one case. It's not to say, certainly, that utilitarianism is preferable. He thinks it is in almost every case, but utilitarianism is certainly not preferable in all cases. But in this case, I mean, it's still debatable. I think, a lot of people may say it is preferable because some people survive, although there are probably theologians, there are probably those that are very sensitive to any kind of discrimination that would say, no, in principle, we can't do this. All right, the other issue that highlights this well, and some of you who know, who have a bit of a background in ethics might be familiar with this problem. It was put forward by Philippa Foot and later by Judith Jarvis Thomson here in the 20th century, and it's called the trolley problem, and it also highlights the issue of utilitarianism versus deontology. So let's look at it like this. If you can see the slide, you have a trolley barreling down the tracks, and no brakes. It's, something's gone wrong. The drivers have no control, and it's headed right towards 5 people, the Griffin family. So it's going to take out, 5 people simply because, I mean, it's fairly random. It's just by accident that the Griffins, for some reason, let's say they're tied down on the tracks, they cannot move. These 5 people can't move from the tracks. But there's a switch on the side of the tracks, and in this case, at least on the slide, Flanders from The Simpsons can throw the switch and divert the runaway trolley, and it will only kill one person, in this case Homer. So, of course, the question is, and I'm sure you can see it coming, should Flanders throw the switch and intentionally kill Homer to save the Griffins? If you are a utilitarian, the answer is clear. More utility is maximized by killing Homer and saving the Griffins. One person dies versus 5. If you are a Kantian or a deontologist, the answer is not so clear. And in many cases, the Kantian or the deontologist will say, actually, no, I'm faithful to Kant. I'm faithful to the second categorical imperative. I will never treat someone as a means to an end. So I am not going to intervene in the course of events and intentionally sacrifice Homer to save the Griffins. I mean, in some ways it sounds, a bit absurd, although it's always difficult when you're in those kinds of situations whether to actually directly intend a killing of somebody. But it seems perhaps more reasonable to play the utilitarian and to save the lives of 5 rather than 1. But it's a question of principle. Are you devoted to the utilitarian perspective or the principles within the deontological perspective? There's another version that's been added to this, and that is really the addition of a fat man, actually. And this is the language, I believe, that Judith Jarvis Thomson comes up with. It's a fat man that is standing on a bridge and could be pushed over the bridge, and this would stop the trolley from barreling down and hitting the Griffins. So let's say Flanders and the switch are not in the picture this time. There is no switch. You happen to be standing on a bridge. There's an unusually large fat man who you suspect, if he were to fall onto the tracks and get killed, he would also slow the train or the trolley enough to save the lives of the griffins. So what would you do in that case? Well, you know, social psychologists have looked at this, and most people, what they've said is most people, in the previous example with Flanders, most people would throw the switch. About 84% of the people would throw the switch and kill Homer to save the 5 people. But in the case with the fat man, only about, I think it's 11 or 9% of the people would actually push a fat man over, or suggest that they would push the fat man over. And of course, you know, nobody's done this in practice. Who knows if they would actually have the courage to follow through with this. But people are much, now but the thing is, what's the difference? That's the curious thing, and that's the beguiling, difficult thing that ethicists and psychologists have a hard time answering. What is the difference? I mean, in one case, it's throwing a switch from a distance and you kill somebody. In the other case, it seems to be much more deliberate and somehow more voluntary, more active, you know, actually pushing the guy over the edge. But, you know, it shouldn't, in principle, though, it seems like it shouldn't matter, because in both cases, you know, killing Homer or killing the fat man, you produced a dead person. So anyway, certainly the deontologist would have a very hard time with that, and, you know, would obviously not, you know, a strict deontologist would not be sacrificing the fat man. So, you know, just to wrap up, in the final chapters that we look at, we take particular interest in end-of-life issues, and especially rationing of healthcare. And this will probably always be a problem, as long as, you know, we can't cure the common cold and we can't cure death itself. There's always going to be a sort of scarcity of healthcare resources out there. So how do we distribute? You know, it comes down to that principle of justice that we looked at for the Belmont principles. How do we distribute equally, or maybe not equally, but most justly, the resources that are available? And the position that's been put forward is, and it's actually becoming more popular, is this utilitarian position that says, well, okay, let's look at it economically. And utilitarianism overlays well with economics, because it's a matter of sort of trying to maximize the greatest benefits at the least costs, which is, you know, economics calls cost-benefit analysis. So what's the suspicion here then? Well, we may need to redirect. What we've been doing in the past is we've had a more Kantian or deontological model, which is to say we tried to treat everybody that comes in to a hospital or needs medical attention equally. You know, if somebody needs care, we give it to them, or we try our best to give it to them. But with an aging population, with baby boomers, with less, you know, smaller demographic to support the aging population, the question has become more pronounced. How should we distribute these resources? Because, as our textbook says, something like 60% of our healthcare dollars are spent in the last year of life. And of the last, let's see, 2 months, of the 60%, 80% are spent in the last 2 months. So who knows what that's like? Something like 50% is spent in the last 2 months of life. So what does that mean? Well, are we getting the benefits that we should expect from the costs that we're paying? We're paying an awful lot of money and resources in these last few days of life. Could that money and resources be used better? In the last few days of life, people are often suffering. They're often unhappy to begin with. They're often in pain. These end-of-life heroic measures, are they worth it anyway for oftentimes terminal situations? Or could we use these resources and the budget basically to improve life before the end of before sort of these terminal diagnoses and these end-of-life times. So, and it turns out to prevent diseases, with vaccinations is remarkably inexpensive. To prevent malaria, for example, is surprisingly inexpensive. The Gates Foundation, for example, is doing this with simply supplying netting, metal or plastic netting, to keep mosquitoes away in countries where there's, where there's a big malaria problem. We could use a lot of these resources and budget and money and time and doctors used at the end of life earlier in healthcare to improve and perhaps even prolong the lives of healthier people. So, it's all to say where it seems to be, the book at least points out, that we're moving towards a more utilitarian consideration of how to allocate these resources, which may not be a bad thing. Or, going back to the slippery slope, you could see that it potentially could be problematic if this is a first step towards, well, who knows, maybe not supporting or caring for properly people in their old age, or at least in their dying days. Okay, well, as a sort of general roundabout summary here, that's all I have to say. So hopefully I'll hear from you, and we can go over some of the material in the papers. Okay, thank you.